Hey guys, welcome back. It's Meg. Today we're going to take a look at the Mistweaver starter build talent tree that Blizzard has given us. The talent tree starter builds, from my understanding, are what they're recommending to players for most forms of content. And I would assume that because it is considered a starter build, that it is also operating under the assumption that you have not played the spec before. So we're going to go through it and we're going to kind of pull it apart and see what they're thinking, and then we can talk about concerns, and we're also going to be talking about things that I would probably change. So starting out here, we have the basic, Soothing Mist. That's what you're given as Mistweaver, Rising Sun Kick, and Tiger's Lust. I will take all of these things in my build. I think that these are good for players to start using, mainly because Tiger's Lust is a good form of utility. It is a kind of like a half freedom ability, and then we also have Rising Sun Kick, which is one of our melee abilities that plays into a lot of other parts of the kit. Calming Presence I think is good for new players or players that are new to Monk, just because it's a little bit of a safety blanket. It is only 3%, but it is something that may be making the difference between someone living and dying or getting frustrated. Mistweaver being a melee healer, a lot of people may find themselves in an uncomfortable situation in melee, so having that little Calming Presence there I think is actually very beneficial for new players. Improved Roll I would probably not end up taking, and I would just take Celerity instead. This is more of a personal choice. I think that I would probably end up passing on this because I would also pass on everything on this side. Tiger Tail Sweep I don't really find a whole lot of value in. I would much rather take something on the right side of the tree, which is geared a little bit more towards damage. And then Elusive Mist, I would also not be recommending this, mainly because it is encouraging you to channel Soothing Mist. And coming at this from a Mythic Plus perspective, it's not really something I would recommend to people to get in a good habit of, mainly because Soothing Mist is something that is limiting your mobility, and it's also going to be making you plant, and that is not something we're really aiming to do, especially with the new build. We have a lot of mobility. Vigorous Expulsion, I don't dislike or like. I will also probably be skipping this in my build, but it is nice that they are trying to utilize some of the abilities that get used less by Mistweavers, that being Expel Harm. I'm actually a big fan of the ability itself, but I'm not going to be putting many points into making it stronger. Grace of the Crane is a nice little safety blanket as well. It increases all of the healing taken by 8% or 4% if you only put 1 point into it. And in the build that they gave us, they put in 2 points for the full 8%. This is nice because if you are learning something, you are most likely going to be making more mistakes, as I said earlier in reference to Calming Presence. It is kind of just that little safety blanket of, hey, you know what, I can take this off later if I want to, when I get more comfortable with the healing, when I get more comfortable with the damage patterns, so I can prepare better. So that's something that I think is nice, but I do believe that that is intended, as well as Calming Presence, to be training wheels that are taken off later. Improved Detox. I think this one's a little obvious. You definitely want to be taking this. Not being able to dispel certain things is going to be pretty crippling in a lot of these dungeons. I'm only able to think of one disease effect at the moment, and that is in a key that we do not have access to yet. And then there's a couple of poison dispels, but most of the time we're going to end up taking this anyway. So I think it's good that they included that. Jumping back over here to improve Vivify, I feel like this one's a no-brainer. We get the increased healing from Vivify. That is obviously something that everyone is going to want. I think that one's pretty obvious that it's the choice. Same with Vivacious Vivification. Every 10 seconds we get the instant Vivify. That is really nice in encouraging players who are new to Mistweaver to understand that we are still going to be casting some, but we are not fully reliant on Soothing Mist, nor are we fully reliant on some of the more melee-based things. Paralysis is a good piece of utility to have. I don't know if I will personally end up taking Improved Paralysis. If you find yourself constantly using this, especially if you are pugging, if you are not really super comfortable with using your defensives, you can use it as a stop. So that could end up being good, but I would probably end up putting this point somewhere else. Ferocity as One is something that I will absolutely end up taking. I think it's odd that it's not included in this, but I do believe that they are trying to encourage new Mistweavers to take more of a healer first perspective, but that is very hard to do while also playing a melee healer, because a lot of this actually ends up resulting in healing. Spearhand Strike, giving a healer a kick, is something that only shamans are used to, or if you play DPS that you're used to, but to throw a new healer into a situation where they are also expected to kick could be a bit overwhelming. So I think that I understand the thought process behind not having them take this in the starter build, but I do think that it would be harmful to them to never include it. Transcendence is another piece of utility. We do kind of need that just to get access to all this other stuff. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of thinking going into that, but we're obviously going to be taking this. Ring of Peace is a monk staple, and I believe that it is very important for Mistweavers to learn how to use it. It's one of our most useful abilities in a Mythic Plus setting, and it occasionally has use in Raid as well. Fortifying Brew, this one I'm going to pass on, but I totally understand them giving it to monks that are either new or returning. This is kind of like one of the monk abilities that you think of when you're like, okay, what does Mistweaver have? What does Monk have? Fort Brew. That's our main defensive. But we do have access to diffuse and dampen at the same time. So I do think it's odd that they're opting for the 1 defensive versus the 2 defensive route, especially this one being a longer cooldown. It's a 4-minute versus a 2-minute and a 1.5. Granted, it covers either magic only or all damage instead of just all damage. I'm thinking they're trying to give us as few buttons to think about as possible with a starter build, because I find it very odd that they're just giving them the 1 defensive when 2 would most likely be more useful for a new player. Clarity, we talked about earlier, I'll be taking this. I think this is a good choice. Profound Rebuttal, again, we're kind of only taking it to get close to heart. We don't really have a choice there. Diffuse, though, and Dampen, I'm concerned with them not taking, as well as Fast Feet. They don't seem to be opting into this, leaning into the damage much at all, which is partially concerning. We'll take a closer look at that when we look at the class tree, though. Chi Wave versus Chi Burst, that's a choice node. Chi Burst is better for Mistweaver, but I think that the other 2 specs, I may be wrong about that, the other 2 specs use Chi Wave, so it may be something that they're more familiar with, but typically Chi Burst is where I would end up going with this. Close to Heart I will be taking, Save Them All I'll be taking, and I will absolutely not be taking Jade Serpent Statue. If I were to fix just this little cluster, I would just take out Jade Serpent. If they're going along the lines that I think they are, where they're trying not to give them too many buttons, too many things to think about, then Jade Serpent I would absolutely not include with that philosophy. Strength of Spirit's alright. It's not terrible, but again, I've mentioned up here with Vigorous, I'm not going to be taking things that empower my Expel harm, mainly because the Instant Vivify is going to be better, and I think that it is important to kind of nurture the idea that you can cast and you can still use Vivify. Not everything has to be instant, even though you are a melee healer. Generous Pour I will also be taking. This is very good utility. This is also a passive ability, and I think that this is a good recommendation. So I'm gonna go through this and basically undo everything that I wouldn't do. I'm pretty much just going to make the builds that I would play. But I am obviously coming from a much different place than a lot of other monks are. I know that this is meant for a starter build, and not necessarily a... I know that this is a starter build and not necessarily meant for players who are looking to push content, but I do think that it is important that it is at least sending them in the right direction, and that is melee healers that rely on doing damage. Okay. Now moving over to our class tree, or spec tree, rather. We have enveloping at the top. I feel like, you know, we don't really have much choice in these. We are going to be taking all the way down to here. I believe I agree with all of these choices. There's not much to disagree with. Essence Font as well. Life Cocoon. One of my biggest concerns with this is that they don't have you taking Teachings of the Monastery. This is what allows you to stack your Tiger Palm, and what allows you to, you know, also get more value out of Spirit of the Crane, which I would also take in this situation. But my main concern with that is that they're not encouraging the melee playstyle, even though they are very clearly designing it to be melee. So that is a really big concern there. Taking Thunder Focus Tea down to get into the middle. Revival versus Restoral. I think that giving them just Revival, the normal one that is supposed to dispel, is smart, because that's kind of the more classic version of the ability. Uplifted Spirits versus Zen Pulse. These are both going to be options in a Mythic Plus setting, and then we can take Font of Life in Raid. But if we're just talking in keys, Uplifted Spirits is a fine choice for if you are doing a key that has a little bit more damage going out, or if they have smaller packs where Zen Pulse isn't really going to be of value. Okay, here's where I start to have a lot of problems. Rapid Diffusion, good. Love that. 2 points in there, call it good. But they decided that Invoke Yulon was their suggestion over Chi-Ji. I very, very strongly disagree with this choice, but we can talk about it as we get further down. They take Mistrap, which is fine. It's another passive ability that will increase your healing. I'm not going to be taking it. I'd much rather have something else. Enveloping Breath is an obvious choice. That is basically the other half of your major cooldown, and now it is your only cooldown as well. So that is something that we will be very looking forward to. Mist of Life I will be taking, but that is also because I am not putting it into Mistrap. It kind of just goes back and forth with whether you want this one or that one. Both are fine choices. And then Yu'lon's Whisper is also something that I would end up picking. But Dancing Mist and Overflowing Mist, this ability got nerfed and it is not quite as valuable anymore. It is passive, and I think that, again, that is kind of the route that they're going, as opposed to the Zen Pulse and Zen Reverberation route, which is, again, totally fine. Keep the buttons low while you're trying to figure out your class. I'm totally cool with that. Dancing Mist I will also be taken. So my biggest issue with this tier is Yu'lon and Life Cycles. Big issue with Yu'lon is that it is, I want to say, more difficult to utilize properly, especially in a Mythic Plus setting, because you are going to be blowing through your mana much faster with this than you would with Chi-Ji. Chi-Ji is very, very low in terms of actual mana spent to get a lot of healing out, and I think that mana management is one of the things that Mistweaver really struggles with historically. Not so much now, especially because we have access to 2 different mana talents, but I think that suggesting Yu'lon is very misleading. And this kind of leans more into the caster build, which I am personally not a fan of, and I don't recommend it to people, but it is technically an option if you are looking to do a little bit more casual content and not looking to push. So my main issue is that they are not enforcing this idea of a melee healer. Mainly over here, we changed all of this already, but they weren't taking anything that increased damage or required, melee kick range or anything like that. So they're definitely leaning more towards kind of the pure healer, which I dislike the term. I dislike the concept, but as a beginner healer, I think that is probably what you are expecting. So that might not be bad. I might just be coming at it from a different perspective. But personally, I don't think that Yu'lon here is a good choice at all for beginner players. I think that Chi-Ji should be the default. And then cycles. Here's the thing. The thing with life cycles is that people think that it is better or easier than Manatee, which is the choice node with it, but it requires you to follow a rotation that is just super unrealistic. It requires you to do Enveloping Mist and Vivify, Enveloping Mist and Vivify to get actual use out of it. And you're like, oh, it's passive, I don't have to think about it, but you don't actually get much value out of it unless you're doing that back and forth Enveloping Vivify, which is going to burn your mana way faster than you would if you just weren't using it at all and you were just healing normally. And 2, you don't have the freedom to use it on whatever you want at that point. Whereas Manatee, it is 1 button every minute and a half, so it's not passive, but you do get a lot more value out of it than life cycles because you are going to be playing more to the way that you were supposed to be playing, rather than playing around this talent that ultimately is going to end up burning more mana than it saves by halving it. So I think this talent should get deleted. I don't know any Mistweaver that actually likes life cycles. Manatee all the way for me. So I think it's concerning that they are suggesting that, because usually, there's an argument for Yu'lon, there's an argument for Uplifted or whatever, but there's no argument for life cycles. There isn't really ever a situation where I see anyone suggesting it, other than the fact that you don't want to push a button. Which, the whole passive thing, we have a lot of passive abilities, so I'm not really sure that I agree with that, but it is something that has come up before with players. They're looking for less buttons. But it is something that is going to enforce bad playstyle habits. Down here, Clouded Focus. Again, it is kind of like it was over here. They had taken Elusive. It is encouraging more of that caster build, and that was with the Yu'lon, like they had said. I do not agree with this at all either. I know that it says it's going to fit most forms of content, and I know that PvP exists, and Clouded Focus, I believe, is still the choice in PvP. But this is a choice node with Ancient Teachings, and Ancient Teachings just blows Clouded Focus out of the water in terms of how many different ways you can use it. I think that is much friendlier to a new Mistweaver, mainly because it takes away that problem of maintenance healing, of constantly casting, of not having time to hit other buttons because you're healing. I think that there's a lot that they thought would be good for new Mistweavers that actually ends up being more harmful to them because it's setting them up for a playstyle that isn't going to last very long. So, big issue with Clouded Focus here. Much prefer Ancient Teachings. Jade Bond's a good choice. I really like this ability. Or, I guess, talent. It's not an ability because it's passive, but Gifts of the Celestials is also something that could be taken. This is probably going to be a per dungeon or per raid boss situation, mainly because they cover different profiles, but Jade Bond is what I've been happy with lately. And then we have Mending Proliferation. I do not like this ability. I think that, again, I've said it multiple times throughout this video, that they are kind of pushing this passive playstyle onto people, but I think that this is pushing them into a really mana-hungry, caster-heavy playstyle. It just happens to also have a bunch of passive stuff. I would take this out completely. I do not find value in this at all. Secret Infusion, saw this ability back in BFA. I was a really big fan of it then. I would not put 2 points into it because I will be going down the Night Fae route when we go back through this and kind of fix it a bit. Misty Peaks, again, big fan of this as well. This is something I'll be using in all of my builds, as well as Rapid Diffusion, Secret Infusion. Most of this, like most of the passive things that they have here are correct outside of what we talked about with Life Cycles and Mistrap, and there's a couple choices there. Focus Thunder. This feels like a T caster build. I'm not a big fan of it. I also would not take Upwelling unless it was a raid setting, but that is a little bit more, I guess, advanced. It's not really, but it is more advanced than Mistweaver was last tier, with Fallen Order and Essence Font and RJW being your whole raid rotation. I don't want to call it advanced at all, actually, but it is one more button to kind of think about, whereas Focus Thunder, once again, is a passive ability. The more and more that I look through this, the more I realize that they're really just trying to give you as few buttons to push as possible. Tear of Morning, I wouldn't recommend this, again, because it plays into this weird caster, I'm not actually in melee builds, but they definitely made their stance on the fact that Mistweaver is a melee healer, so not really sure what happened with the divide between, hey, this is what we suggest you play, versus, hey, this is how it's designed. I don't know what happened in the middle there. But I would definitely be taking Rising Mist here, because that will, again, ultimately end up saving you more time, more mana, and it'll generally just be a more fluid playstyle. But I understand that Tear of Morning is a little bit more of a safety blanket, kind of like our Calming Presence, as well as our Grace of Crane that we talked about earlier. It's a little bit safer, especially for pugs, for new players, don't know mechanics, but I do think that it is setting them up to be in a bad position. Mainly because it's not something that is going to, like I said, age well. As content scales up and gets harder, it's not going to be able to keep up in terms of mana consumption unless you are just being fed innervates in raid, or you have access to innervate and keys, or you don't end up doing key set high, which is fine. Again, everyone has their own content, but I think that setting people up for this kind of playstyle is super misleading. Very similar to the issue that we had back in you know, BFA and previous expansions, where you weren't really required to be in melee until you got Rising Mist, which was way at the end of leveling. You go through your whole leveling process with no requirements for healing to be in melee, and suddenly you're like, here's Ancient Teachings, here's Rising Mist, you're a melee healer now. And a lot of new monks were like, wait, no one said anything about being in melee. If you don't look at the fact that all of your damage abilities are melee, that's not something that's really driven home in leveling content, because it's not super important on leveling content, but it is something that is kind of like gets flipped on its head once you hit max level. You're suddenly expected to do all these things that you weren't taught as you were leveling. So I think that that part might be a bit confusing, and they're probably trying to lean more towards the safer part. But again, I've said it a couple times, I do think that people are being set up to fail with this build. So we are going to move all of our stuff here. We're going to be taking Teachings and Crane because they benefit greatly off of each other. We're also going to take Mist of Life and Yu'lon's Whisper, which they already had. For argument's sake, I am going to take Uplifted Spirits instead of Zen Pulse here, because Zen Pulse I think is pretty niche. We'll take Chi-Chi, we'll take Enveloping Breath, we'll take 2 Dancing Mists. We're getting rid of this entirely, but I will actually take Mana Tea. Even if I don't end up taking this myself, I do think that it's a good button to help people learn how to manage mana. Taking Ancient Teachings. We are taking Jade Bond, we'll take Secret Infusion, Phaline, both Awakened Concordance, Awakened Phaline, and then we're also going to be taking Rising Mist. This is pretty much exact to what I am running on live. You could take a couple of points in the middle here or there and move them around if you don't like certain abilities, but this is generally what we're going to be looking at. This is really where a lot of the melee aspect comes in, as well as with Ancient Teachings, and that plays into Rising Mist as well. It was interesting to me that they decided to give the beginner build the Rising Sun kick, but then not take anything else that actually interacted with that. It felt a little empty. It kind of led them to like a dead end in a way. So this is what I would end up playing. The main reasoning behind this is that this will save you mana because you don't have to cast Essence Font. Essence Font is 7.2% of your mana and Phaeline is 4%, and they do the exact same thing. They both apply the hot, which is the main reason you are using it. And they also give the Ancient Teachings, which is the legendary that they didn't have before, but we have it now. Ancient Concordance is more of a damage to healing type of thing because it does interact with Ancient Teachings. And then Awakened Phaeline is just a extra bit of damage from your Spinning Crane Kick. That's like our AoE healing. And then we also have the increased chance of resets, which is important. It helps save mana, and it helps trigger legendary without having to fall back onto Essence Font, being like almost twice the amount of mana. So I hope that this video was helpful. I hope that I covered everything, at least to an extent that it was understood. This is obviously just my experience. If you are a new Mistweaver and you thought that the original build that they gave was awesome and that you feel super comfortable with it, then that's great, and let me know. I'm trying to get multiple different perspectives now for content, whereas in the past I focused on kind of pushing Mistweaver to its limits, particularly in a Mythic Plus setting. I realized that that's not everyone's goal, and I would like to be able to answer questions for all Mistweavers. Maybe not PvP because I have zero experience there, but at least for the PvE Mistweavers, I would like to be able to answer questions that would best suit your needs. So if you think I missed anything, or if you think that I am expecting too much out of new players or new monks, or you think I'm expecting too little out of them, please let me know. I'm very curious to see the different perspectives from the different players. So that's kind of all I've got for you guys today. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next video.